Welcome to the Analytics Power Hour. Analytics topics covered conversationally and sometimes with explicit language.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. It's the Analytics Power Hour. This is episode 288. You know, we spent the last decade putting walls around our data, securing it, governing it, putting labels on it. And now the AI revolution walks up and is like, hey, can I see all that? Today, we're going to discuss Model Context Protocol, or MCP. I mean, it's an open standard, promises to stop all the copy-paste madness and let AI talk directly to your data systems. Is it the end of the data silo or just the beginning of a new governance headache? Well, we're going to try to establish an MVP for PMF of MCP all in one hectic hour. All right, let me introduce my co-host, Val Kroll. How are you doing?
I'm good. This is going to be an interesting one. Yeah.
All my acronyms. Yeah, that was fun. All right, Tim Wilson, always a pleasure.
Likewise.
All right, I just use the acronyms to make myself sound smart, that's all. Let's get that in early. And I'm Michael Helbling. All right, well, we need a guest, someone to help us dive into this topic, and we've got a great one. Sam Redfern is a staff data scientist at Canva, currently working on search and recommendations there, and previously marketing measurement. Prior to that, he has held data roles at both Meta and IAG, and today he is our guest. Welcome to the show, Sam.
Thank you very much, Michael, Tim, and Val. Really excited to be here. First time caller, long time listener.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, we'll ask questions and take our answers off the air. No. So, Sam, I'm excited to talk to you about this because obviously all things AI are very of the moment and everyone sees the term MCP. But I think if we just take a step back, maybe you could just fill us in on what exactly an MCP is, Model Context Protocol. Where did it come from? Give us some background on the whole concept to kind of establish the conversation today.
No worries. So, super pumped to be talking about this. So let's take a step back and think about what this is solving, in a sense, right? We've had access to these large language model tools for a little while now, right? And so in the early days of GPT-2 and GPT-3, before ChatGPT, these things were kind of like word calculators in a sense. Like I really like the analogy that it's this sort of like it's like you put the numbers into your calculator and you get the equation out, right? This is the same for almost words. Like early large language models acted like that. And the innovation on in the OpenAI space was to basically feed the output back into the input and make this resumable kind of format. And what's interesting about this whole, so let's step back from MCP and branding and letting tech companies come up with, letting technical teams come up with the term for things, because this is how we got NFTs as a term at the same time. But the core problem to be solved with these is that we've got something that feels a little bit like a person in the sense that you will give it as some words and it will respond with some words back. And could you give that agent or that large language model the ability to do something other than just converse? And so the first application of tool use, in a sense, in large language models actually came from the LangChain, the open source LangChain team. And for those who don't know what LangChain is it's a framework for building agentic experiences. And so you can have your you can have your Anthropic model or your OpenAI model or whatever you want, and then allows you to piece together bits of technology to add context into the large language model to try and get it output. And so in April 2023, PR was submitted to the LangChain project, allowing it to open up for the large language model to take a browser URL and to go have the backend application request the contents of that HTML and then bring it back into the context window of the agent itself. And if you think about it as like the core thing that it's trying to do is it's trying to get this I kind of think about it as fingers in a sense, as like it's trying to give the large language model the ability to touch something, a bit of information, bring it closer to it for it to understand. And that's at its core what these MCP tools are. MCP is like a brand term through Anthropic, and it's to say it's a standard is to be very generous, but I'm really bullish about the concept of giving these large language models access to tools for them to be able to solve problems.
So I have to admit that I really did think that MCP was just like the API for LLMs. But the more I was looking into this, it was kind of understanding that those fingers, like you used in your analogy, is really giving it more access than just here's this endpoint and it's just a one-time thing. Can you talk about some of the things that you give it access to with those fingers or to grab to kind of give a little bit more color to what it actually does or what it's capable of, if that makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is sort of in the weeds of how they work. Just to sort of, I think the context to understand is like if you've ever done work inside of large enterprises and you've tried to create an application access username and password, it's a total pain in the butt to go get this thing. And then your infrastructure team is like, well, you got to change the password every 3 weeks. And, you know, like then you have to have like a cryptographic token to do something. And it's like in some sort of space. And the reason why, so actually Anthropic had a previous attempt at tool use in October 2024, a month before MCPs were announced, where they had a system that would take over your browser and move your cursor around. And the reason why MCPs are running on your local computer is that your user account has access to all these systems, right? Like that's why the early paradigms of these systems are as close as possible to the end user's system. So the analogy I kind of give on like the fingers in a sense is inside these MCPs, you can give it access to like any number of the standard allows you to sort of use represented as any number of tools, and you have bits of information, right? So when the agent starts, it's basically given a list of all the tools that the MCP server has available to the agent. And so it has the name of the tool. And so let's just do a really simple example of in our agent environment, we have two tools, right? One of them is called a saw and the other one's called a drill, right? And so in our saw tool, we would describe the name as saw. We would say the description is it cuts wood in a single direction across a line. And then the inputs to that is the position of the wood and the depth, right? So that is a finger, for lack of a better term. Now, that allows you to, and so that's our first tool, and our second tool might be drill, right? And so that allows you to drill a hole through the piece of wood.
Okay. So I have to ask one more. Sorry, I'm hogging the air. But I guess the one other thing that I'm struggling to grasp a little bit is like, what was the need for standardization of this, like the protocol? Like, could you talk about what that is solving? Because what you shared in that analogy was great. I'm absolutely going to use that, and I'll give you credit every time. But like, why was there a need to standardize outside of like, enterprises, would feel more secure with that, or, the governance would be easier. But is there any more to it than just that piece?
In the adoption curve, we are so far away from the governance piece on this stuff. Like there's a bunch of companies right now that are trying to put governance around these systems. And I'm sure at some point we'll talk to maybe some of the potential downsides of this standard if we want to call it that. But the reason why Anthropic went down this path is in the technical details around how the LLM is trained. They have been doing this work of training the large language model to use this like special escape set of characters. So when the large language model is like, okay, I think what I need to do is use the saw tool, and then it has this string of characters, saw tool, string of characters, and that indicates to the sort of the agent that's hosting the large language model, okay, I have to take the text below this and send it into the tool itself with its like the input parameters that it needs for it. And so Anthropic had this huge lead because they'd done the work of training their large language models for tool use and using their reinforcement techniques to basically say, this is what you have to do. And this was this huge lead that Anthropic had for like a couple of years in a sense, right? Since, well, I mean, everything feels like it's a couple of years, but
it's all relative.
It's really about 8 months, right? Until other people started trying to solve this problem. OpenAI had their own sort of call procedures kind of method, or like, I think they were called functions. And it was a very similar kind of thing. Like anyone could have come up with a standard. The core problem they were trying to solve is how do you give the large language model a hand for it to basically make decisions about what information is pulled towards it, or what information or what actions it takes when it's pushing out.
This is like slowly coming a little more into focus and still pretty damn fuzzy for me. So I know like recently it seems like there's been a lot of chatter about Google Analytics having an MCP server. Is that the right terminology? And that is something that the Google team said, we're going to produce this to basically make this is a saw, this is what it does, these are the inputs, and it's just a much long, I mean, your analogy was very, very simple. Is it as simple as that? Which has me going back to saying, well, when Val said it's like an API for LLMs, it sure sounds like an API for LLMs, and I'm missing where that analogy is breaking down.
I think you can use it like there's a lot of analogies of sort of talking about these MCP tools as being the early days of APIs and stuff like that as well. I think there's an extra bit of like the near direction of where these systems are moving, which is more sort of interesting in the API part. But just to sort of like come back to that, the way I kind of think about it, I don't like APIs is like a great way of talking about it. And there's lots of people doing weird, fun things with these tools right now. Where if you remember, I think some of us on the call are old enough to remember the early days of Web 2.0 and people were making APIs for like the weather and it was open and everything was fine. And, we were very far from like the standardized way of we think about this sort of stuff now, right? Like it's, the way you design an API is very standardized now. I think the thing that's different is, one, we're dealing with this huge amount of non-determinism, right? So, and we're dealing with all of these different, terms and terminologies that exist. So I think everyone on the call, everyone on the podcast might have heard of the term agent, right? And so an agent is the idea where you have a resumable output. You have like some text that is the system prompt, and then you have sort of this resumable kind of conversation. There's another term that's being formed right now called a harness. And a harness is an idea where you have an agent and you have a tool plugged into the side of it. And so and then that has like a domain of knowledge attached to it at the same time. And so Cursor is an agent. The Claude desktop is an agent. Cursor is a harness, right? It's got access to all these different tools. I actually think of MCP and where it's at right now is more akin to these digital document formats like XML, right? So we started with XML, and the number of people who are writing XML these days is almost none. However, the amount of change of this like standardized document format then brought us to JSON, and now it has unfortunately brought us to YAML and Markdown, and like we are at the XML stage of this development. Is that this is going to like tool use conceptually attaching to large language models through agents and harnesses is that is going to stay for a long time. Whether it's the MCP standard or someone comes along with a better standard, then we'll see how that goes.
You know how developers got the AI engineer role? It's time for the rest of us. I think we're witnessing the rise of the AI analyst.
Okay, does that just mean asking a chatbot to do math? Because I have Excel for that, Michael.
Well, no, Tim, I'm talking about Ask Why. It's full stack analytics. I ask a question in plain English, and the product Prism orchestrates the whole thing. You can pull in data from Excel or BigQuery.
Whoa. Hold on, you're sending BigQuery data to an LLM? Security is going to have a heart attack.
Well, that's the best part. Ask Why doesn't upload your data.
Explain?
Well, it creates a semantic layer. It sends the context to the LLM writes the code, and that code runs locally on your data. Your actual numbers never touch their servers, so it's totally traceable.
Huh. So I get the automation, but my data stays safe and secure?
Exactly. Plus, it remembers context. So as you automate routine tasks, it stores those so you don't have to explain it all again the next time you do that same task.
Okay, I'm listening. Where do I get it?
Well, it's in beta right now, and you can go to ask-y.ai. That's ask-y.ai. You can get ahead of the curve and join the ranks of the AI analysts.
And because we like you guys, use code APH when you sign up, and our friends at Ask Why will put you at the top of their waitlist.
Yep, stop pasting data into black boxes. Get Ask Why.
That I've had the XML question as well, as whether it was, because I remember that being coming from an HTML world, and then XML came out, and it's like, look, XML doesn't give a shit about what you're rendering in a browser, but it is this structured world. So I feel like, and then JSON I sort of understood because of the XML, and that makes sense because there was talk of saying different applications uses would say, using this XML structure, let's define kind of specifically how that is going to be used in the context of this financial services thing. So you're saying that is also a useful, if imperfect, analogy?
Yeah, look, history sort of rhymes more than copies in a sense, right? Like, it's going to, it's the first time in software that we've had this amount of non-determinism to deal with, right? You think about like what success has meant in software development or data before, and it's like some human's ability to remember some random function as part of a library and be able to write that code as fast as possible and do it in as perfect, as close to grammar as possible. The problem with this new world that we're going into is the skill of dealing with non-determinism is not closely overlapping with that historical set of skills. And so it's going to feel different. And people who talk about the vibes of a model, like there's some truth in it, in a sense, right? Like getting a feel, and it's true with tool design. So when you're building an MCP, so we'll just go back to the MCP sort of like paradigm. And so you're thinking about the tools that you're building, and the fingers that you're giving this agent and this harness access to. Like when you're starting out, you're doing kind of the early playful part of programming in a sense, right? Where you're just like, oh, does this connect to this? And when I run through it, what problems do I see with it? Like I do think that like it feels like those early days of these standards and people are playing around with them. And then when you want to get serious about the thing that you're building, you're then looking through the agent logs. You're seeing what tools it's calling. You're seeing the parameters. You're seeing how many times it correctly passes in the correct parameters and everything like that.
So let me hit the non-determinism point. And maybe I'm going to go back to using the Google Analytics MCP as a example that the client, the application that's hooked, the agent that is hooking in and using the MCP, say it's a LLM at its core. So it's, and maybe I'm missing I'm thinking of that as being, it's a probabilistic thing, but it's hitting the MCP to get stuff back. Is the MCP necessarily also kind of non-deterministic, or is it no, like the inputs may be kind of floating around a little bit, but or maybe it just depends on what it's an MCP for. If in the Google Analytics example, I would say if the input is users in the last month, that the MCP would say, well, as long as that, or is it that input's going to come in with a little squishiness in it, and it's up to the MCP to say, I got to figure out what I should go and pull and return.
Yeah, and I think this is sort of a good point to sort of talk about this like interesting dimensions that's coming up recently, right? So if I was Google Analytics team, which I'm definitely not, and I'm, I don't think I've used Google Analytics for over a decade, and I missed many of the big transitions, and so I'm probably not the best person to talk about GA, but So the Google Analytics MCP is going to have this problem where like they have these dimensions and measures and breakdowns, and then they're obviously trying to do it on the cheap on the inside. And so they're only storing some of the information, right? So they're going to have like a basic report kind of tool, which is like, here's all so it's going to be called the report tool, right? And the name of it is going to be like, traffic analysis. And it's going to be like, put the date range in, and then it's just going to return back like a very minimized array of the sort of what the traffic is. Just to check,
with that report tool, that would be like a saw, but there's going to be separately a drill. And so, okay, when you're saying a tool, that is a tool that's available as part of the MCP. Okay.
Yeah, okay. That's right. Gotcha. Now, where this gets sort of interesting, and Anthropic announced, for lack of a better term, I think a couple of days ago, announced this code execution with MCPs, right? And allowing you to actually write code. And this is the thing that I've actually found over the last couple of weeks, which is it's way better getting the LLM to write code to interact with APIs or SQL or something along those lines than it is to actually give it access to all of these tools and all of these intermediary steps. And so if and you might have seen this from your own experience of, you're probably spending a little bit less time hacking away at a piece of SQL, getting it to form exactly what you want it to these days. You're probably spending a bit more time of like, here's all the table space that I'm working on. Here is a thing that I want to query. Here's what the outputs look like. And then you're sort of having this sort of feedback loop where you're doing that work. And my guess is that if you wanted to build a more sophisticated MCP, and if you were Google, you would actually lean into this concept where you would let the agent go build a little piece of Python code or JavaScript or something along those lines to query a bunch of known API endpoints to form the data back in the way that you want it to. Snowflake has its MCP server, and Canva would make something called Data MCP, which takes all of this data information we have and allows the LLM access to understanding how to use it. This is you're really doing this piece of work around context engineering, and you're trying to think about like, what is the LLM going to put into this tool for then it to get this output out. And so, Michael, just to answer your sort of question here, is that the MCP tool itself is deterministic, right? So it is an application in the traditional software sense, and I think a lot of these MCP tools are sending data outside of out to the internet, right? They're connected to an API or a SQL database or something along those lines. But you can have deterministic tools inside of the MCP server as well that's locally, that's connected. So you could just have like a calculator tool, and it just adds numbers together and then returns exactly the right number out. We've heard the joke of counting the number of R's in strawberry, right? So you could have a little Python function that just counts the number of R's in strawberry. And it's just like, all right, the R counter tool, put the word strawberry in, and this is how many R's you get back. And so this is the whole idea of, and this is, I understand I'm going to do shout outs later on, but Zed, which is an IDE, has an agentic engineering series. And what they're saying, and I just think that they have this really great framing of the problem that we're working on today, which is how do you take the advantages of non-deterministic systems and couple it with the advantage of deterministic systems to get something more than the sum of its components.
So I would love to take a little bit of a turn, because you've teased it a little bit, but I'm so eager to hear some of your favorite use cases and examples, Sam, that you can talk about. And I know you mentioned before, it's still early days, but if you could talk about some of the things that you felt like weren't possible for, or too much effort for, what it was worth in the past, but now it's unlocked this or solved this for you.
I'll talk a little bit about some of the stuff we've got working inside of Canva at the moment. And so we use a large database vendor, which I will keep their name out of just so they don't get in trouble. They're going down this path of building out their own set of MCP tools and stuff like that. But what's interesting, and what I think is a big opportunity for people in this space, is that building these tools for your organization is actually the sort of critical skill that we're going to see in the coming sort of period of time. Like every organization or company is really different in a sense, right? And they made a database choice 5 years ago, and they made like a data transformation tool choice like 4 years ago. And you have all the incremental knowledge and information that's built on top of that, which is going to kind of be unique to your organization in a sense, right? And I think there's going to be vendors who are building tools in this space. But if you're sort of a mid-sized company, like I think something to really think about is building customized versions of these tools that actually work with the flows of your organization, and really having teams that are like thinking about these agentic engineering practices on how to actually automate parts of the work that people don't want to do. So some of the use cases that I'm sort of playing around at the moment, just the last week, I've been working on using the Altair Python visualization library, and actually building a Python-based sort of sandbox environment for it to run the Altair code. And so the way this works is you just put the SQL statement of the data that you want to pass into the Altair code, and then you have a Python sandbox part of or field of the tool, which just puts 300 lines of Python into it, and it builds the visualizations out of it, right? So using these really nice Python visualization libraries has always been a pain in the butt unless you tattoo the way every part of the application works on your arm, so you can know exactly how it works. But again, we don't have to worry so much about grammar anymore, because if you feed these systems examples, they can come back and like help you visualize this way faster. And I think that's where, Zed has this post where their concept is leverage, not magic, right? And what we're trying to do is we're trying to take our staff members and we're trying to make them move faster and explore more in a shorter period of time to get to a better end outcome. Just on other sort of like interesting, fun use cases, I've been at home, I've got like my own little sort of home lab kind of thing and stuff like that. And part of playing around with that is there's all these command switches and stuff like that. And so I built a custom MCP server for home that documents all the different applications that I use in the CLI, and it has all of the context of it. And so I basically put in a free text field of like what I'm trying to do. It then uses a search engine to search over the data. It then takes that context, it puts it into the LLM, and then the LLM goes and gives me all the command switches and stuff like that. Another one is, I think the reason why Mo recommended me for this is I gave a presentation at MeasureCamp about, at MeasureCamp, you have to like come up with a job, with a talk title, otherwise people don't show up, right? So I said that, MCP is the real apex predator for your job in 2026. And obviously, I don't think that's true, but so I wrote that. Someone was like, you need to give a talk, Sam. I was like, fine. So I wrote that card at 11 o'clock. I then vibe coded up remember the game Battleship? And so I made a version of Battleship that uses MCP tools as the fingers that the LLMs can use to play against each other. And then I built an agent harness where I could get different vendors' MCP tools to actually fight the game Battleship against each other. And then you could actually watch the turn-by-turn thing of watching them compete against each other. And they would then have their thinking of like how they thought about the strategy of the other player. And then you could like change the prompt and be like, okay, you are going to be the random player and you're just going to do the most random things you possibly can. And then the other one is like the most strategic player of like, this is the common moves in Battleship. I'm going to do this and stuff like that. And it's just, it's like it's a whole new paradigm of like weird things to play around with. And like MCPs are just like this layer for you to like do this joining between deterministic and non-deterministic systems. But once you start playing with these systems and you're finding different ways of interesting things to do with them, like, it puts the fun back into sort of like the early stages of programming again.
So you giving the context of like deterministic, non-deterministic is really, that's helping it crystallize a little bit in my mind what some of this is. But I do want to go back to when you first started talking about some of these examples. You were talking about how every organization is different. Everyone's working with a different stack. Everything has to be kind of in context of what's, going on inside your organization. Can I just go back and just repeat a little bit one of my earlier questions? Like, what is the value then of the standardization versus it being custom inside of your organization? Is it just about the ability to leverage those other tools that are using MCP, or is there internal benefit too? Like, I guess I might be just it's not clicking for me. I would love to just hear you share.
No. Okay. So MCP is the thing that allows you at the moment, until someone comes up with a better standard. And we should probably talk about some of the downsides of MCP as well. Just all the criticisms as they stand of MCP. But, MCP at the moment allows you to bridge that gap between deterministic and non-deterministic systems, right? And you've got the vendors, and the vendors are going out and they are building their own custom MCPs, right? Because what they're getting is they're getting pressure from leadership teams of like, okay, we need to like get some AI in this organization right now, right? And I have Claude desktop on my computer and I want to be able to query this information directly from Claude and have that come back to me in a sense, right? And MCPs is like a path you can go down there, but the problem is that you're wrestling with the non-deterministic nature of these systems when you do that type of connection in a sense, right? And this is where building up that practice inside of your organization is really important, because when you get into the detail of how these systems work, like you realize that you like giving senior leadership teams access to the raw thing that directly queries the database is problematic for like lots of different reasons around you're not able to check it. You can't give it a system prompt, all that sort of stuff. So MCPs, like the standard, if we can call it that, is just a little connecting block in a sense. The practice of what I'm talking about the non-standardization inside of organizations is that you can totally go use the vendor solutions, right? But it's always going to feel like it's through a fuzzy piece of glass, because unless, you're doing exactly what the vendor has, right? Like, if you're 100% Google shop, right, and you've never used anything other than Google, then maybe the Google stack's going to be great because that's what they're going to be using internally, and they're going to be copying from that of how they're building it. But I don't know about you, but most organizations I ever interact with is it's sort of like a collage of different solutions, and the money is in getting them connect together, right?
Yeah, templatized versus custom, kind of.
Take Altair, take Canva, take Snowflake, take Google Analytics, and MCP for those. Is there the option that Canva or Altair or Snowflake or Google, and those are intentionally very wildly different types of platforms, they can sort of create an MCP, one of these connectors that say this is kind of generic, but there's also an option that I, as a user of Canva with access, I could also build my own MCP, my own connector, or is it okay?
So you're raising on a really good topic, which is called context pollution, right? So there was a criticism of GitHub's MCP server where it has like 24 some number of tools, right? And the majority of people use like 3. Right. And so
push.
Yeah, and the thing is if you get into the details of like how MCPs work, is that they repaste the entire list of tools and the tool descriptions and all this sort of stuff with every single message that goes through, right? Because they are trying to solve the context engineering problem of like the LLM needs to really know what all the tools are at every single turn. And like you can go and add 70 tools to an agent harness, and you should do that to watch it not work, because it's very entertaining and you can suddenly watch all of your context disappear and have all sorts of problems, right?
You got extra tokens to spare? Go ahead and do that. Yeah. Somebody go win the token awards or whatever it is OpenAI did the other day, right? Some people need the token trophy. That's great. But your job as an engineer or a technology person inside of an organization is to do it in the most sensible, reliable way possible, right? And you're trying to harness these non-deterministic systems to get the best outcome. And part of the reason why you go and build that custom harness that is fit for purpose for your organization and has different flavors depending on exactly the task that you're trying to get it to do is you're trying to, it's in the name. You're trying to take that harness and you're trying to constrain this non-deterministic system to only work in this particular domain. I think, a lot of people, when they talk about these MCPs, they're talking about it from their experience of having Claude Desktop on their computer and connecting it up to Jira or some other thing like that, right? And that's a totally valid use case. I don't have to open Jira anymore. I think the favorite part of my job now is when someone assigns me a ticket, I just have Claude Desktop. It's the only thing I have connected to Claude Desktop on my computer. And I interact with all of my Jira tickets through Claude. I've solved the Atlassian interface problem by just never having to open it. Nice.
But that's for me as a human here. Mm-hmm. But when we're talking about making these systems do useful things in your organization that you can't convince engineers to pick up, or it's really boring work, or it's testing work, or something like that, like that's where these systems kind of shine, right? Like we're not trying to put someone out of a job or anything like that. What we're trying to do is we're trying to get those tasks that are, not particularly enjoyable, like documentation, testing, tracking, all this sort of stuff, like building custom harnesses around that to help engineers make the best possible decision when they're building something. That's the real advantage of these tools. Yeah.
And I think, Tim, also, the Google Analytics example is tricky because it's very limited and it basically is an API layer to Google Analytics. It's not really giving you like more MCP-ish type of interaction. So I think it adds to the confusion a little bit because it's like you can do all the same things you can do with the Google Analytics MCP server with their API. It's just call this function. But instead of you writing the query to the API, the LLM does it for you. But it's it's not more stuff.
How does the GitHub MCP server? So I have two questions. One, it sounds like a lot of platforms, maybe of those, if they're 24, and I'm assuming it's not exact, it's however many tools there are within the GitHub MCP server, that a lot of them are just a layer to the API, and maybe there are some that aren't. But if you were saying, we do want to use a GitHub MCP server, this has got too much, would it be like, I'm going to get their MCP server and I'm going to whittle it down and then probably check it back into GitHub just to make things confusing? But like, do MCP servers there could be the official Uber generic one developed by the platform, and then somebody says, yeah, I need to make one that's just a much narrower scope and maybe add some flavor on it, or does it not work that way?
Yeah, great question, Tim. And this is why the agent, like talking about agentic engineering and harnesses is really important, because in a harness, you say, these are the MCP servers, only have these tools, right? And so you can take the GitHub MCP server and you can say, here's your 3 tools, deal with it.
That makes sense.
Sorry, I just, let's not get into the accuracy of AI overviews, but according to, in June 2025, apparently exposes 51 plus tools.
Okay.
Okay.
Which is, but the thing is like, if you're in a world where you narrow that down to a very limited set of the tools. And you can see this in the Claude desktop thing. Like if you load an MCP server onto Claude desktop, you have little switches where you can turn on and off tools in a sense, right? Like the intention of these systems is that you narrow the scope down to exactly the problem that you're working on, and just that. But what's interesting, Tim, is like, why bother having the GitHub? Like if you're doing the coding yourself and you're using it inside of Cursor or something along those lines, it's like, why bother adding the GitHub MCP server at all? Why not just get the LLM to execute something in the command line with all the command switches of the GitHub CLI?
Well, so is this getting us to the downsides?
I was just going to say.
That's where I was going to go.
You've been chomping at the bit, Sam. Let's hear it.
There's part of it feels like this is, it's new enough in Wild Wild West to know there could be a governance issue that it would be very easy to embed MCPs into an organization, and they're not well thought out. They're not well built. It seems like there's just a governance thing, like anything that gets rolled out, that one Sam creates something and all of a sudden the entire organization is dependent on it. And maybe Sam's not very good at, or just half-assed it on a weekend or something. Like, I don't know. So I'm throwing that out, that it seems like there's a governance risk when you're able to do this stuff so quickly and roll it out. Is that one of the downsides?
I mean, building, and this is something Canva does really well, right? Like building AI tools for people to use in the application is just really different to building stuff internally. Like we are still at the early days of this stuff, and Canva's ecosystems team are building out really strong solutions to the space of whether Canva is empty server or a client or something along those lines. So there's like the professional teams who are like building this sort of stuff for external consumption. So in OpenAI, you can use the LLM to interact with you can use GPT-5 or whatever they're calling it these days to interact with Canva and modify your designs and stuff like that. That's all using this style of tool technology in a sense, right? And there's a lot of governance that's been there, right? There's a lot of like thinking about permissioning, thinking about what information we're giving to the LLM, what actions we're giving to it, what are the actual actions that change something. One of the downsides of giving the LLM access to your terminal command line is that it could just do, it could delete all the files in the directory or something along those lines, right? Or I think my favorite one is where, an engineer is trying to get the LLM to write the code so it passes all the tests, and so it solves the problem by deleting the tests, and it's just like, problem solved, I'm done. Yeah. Technically correct, the best type of correct, but actually no, that's not what I wanted. And so this is why that agent harness framework is really useful, because that's where we're like, here is this domain of a problem. Here is this very finite set of tools. Here's how I want you to sort of exactly work on this particular part of the problem. And I don't want you to have this like long chain where you're sort of like jumping between things. I just want to, create the agent sort of instance, have it solve one or two problems, and for the agent instance to end, so then we can move on to the next problem. Like that is how we're trying to solve and harness this non-deterministic nature. Some of the criticisms of this MCP standard is like, one, it's not a standard, right? Like a standard, if we think about it as from the Internet Engineering Task Force, the W3C is like a collection of for-profit companies coming together and sending some of their best engineers to basically have like a very disgruntled call with a bunch of other engineers from other sort of for-profit companies, right? Like, as far as I understand, it's kind of just Anthropic building this internally, publishing stuff on their blog. They picked up Fast MCP, which is like an open source thing, and they just said, all right, this is the standard. We're gonna use this as our standard library and sort of extend it out and stuff like that. Like, I think, coming back to that governance is like, this is not a structure that feels like it's ready for, like, it's buyer beware on the internal corporate governance stuff. And the way you design these systems is really important. And so some of the data tools I build internally, it has no ability to write information to the database, right? Because that is completely like, we're just not ready for that kind of world, right? And maybe in really select kind of instances where there's a really strong harness around it and you have like a checking endpoint and all sorts of other stuff like that and things like that is where things like LangChain are really useful. But we need to, that's why I think most of the value of this space is still in the internal sort of application use cases in a sense, right? Like that's where you can do a more experimentation and worry less about, the strangeness of the internet and AI and all the problems attached to that. But when you're developing these tools internally, you have like a team of, a handful of engineers, and like you can make their lives like tangibly better because they don't have to put context into their mind of a particular part of the problem, and they can just have that answer come back. And even if it's right 90% of the time, it's probably better than when you got your junior data scientist to sort of do it in the first place anyway. So, that's the challenge there. As far as one of the other criticisms of Anthropic's MCP is that it doesn't have authentication baked in, right? Like if most of the MCP, so it's counterintuitive having this term of MCP server and client in a sense, right? And what happens is you're literally running a little application. You're like, Python run this like daemon or something along those lines. And then that is just talking to it's like running a local web server in a sense, right? And that is the security model that has been solved for in the early days. And that's why the Zed has their ACP agent. What is it? Zed ACP. I think in a couple of years we're going to be talking about the agent client protocol as maybe a better way of building this sort of stuff. Everyone sort of agrees that the ACP protocol is probably a better representation of like where we're going in this space. And it is an open standard. I don't think they're sort of like the W3C or the Internet Engineering Task Force style of standard. But back to that XML example, I don't know about you, I don't read a lot of XML these days. Like we're going to be moving to something else, but I'm very bullish on the concept of tool use in these applications and giving large language models these fingers to do things.
Is there any movement? I mean, it sounds like Zed has stepped in and done a little bit of this. Like, is there any movement to say, like the W3C had its different groups and came together that we should get?
Well, didn't like Google and Microsoft and OpenAI, didn't they all adopt it? Like, am I totally misunderstanding?
But it's one thing to adopt it. It's another thing to say, we got to solve authentication. We got to have a recommendation and a standard for how authentication is going to be handled. Means they can't just say, like, it's not there. That's something that needs to be incorporated in a way that they say, yeah, we think this is generally going to work for most. We can all work with this, right? Because it's not a static. I mean, I guess let me ask that question. It's MCP. How static is it? Like when HTML came out, it wasn't like, okay, we're done. Well, there was a bunch of other stuff that was needed and browsers added functionality. And so it was kind of, it naturally had to evolve. And is MCP the same thing that it needs to, yeah.
Yeah. So there's a really interesting part of this, which is that there is I think there is a recommended output format to MCP servers that as part of their standard. But I think what's interesting about this is that like because of the non-deterministic nature of these systems, and because you can, I don't know if you've ever played around with this, but it's always good fun, you can have the start of your question in XML, then you can do the middle bit in YAML, and then the end bit in JSON, and the large language model doesn't skip a beat, and it's just like, oh yeah, sure, I understand this, right? Like it doesn't matter as much is kind of the context of this problem, right? Because, like we required these standards in the early days of the internet because they were purely deterministic systems with incredibly strong grammars, right? And I just don't think it matters as much anymore. And that's why I don't think there's been the same pressure to standardize because you don't need to standardize in the same way. The only thing that matters is, do you pass the tool call threshold in your large language model? And I think it maybe, like rather than a very deliberate standard like TCP/IP or IPv6, I think it's going to be more along the lines of the QWERTY keyboard, which is like, we just kind of picked it because it was there first, not because it's better. And MCP will probably change to something else in the future, right? But the primitives that make it interact with a large language model, I think, are now baked in enough that I would be surprised to see if we move away from that. And all we're going to do is we're going to find new ways of taking those primitives and doing this code execution thing. So I gave my example of this charting sort of like MCP extension that I built. Like, all we're going to do is we're going to take the same primitives, but then we're going to like do wildly different things with them that people didn't think was possible before.
And at some point that will have shifted to a point that it's got a new label and it's like, oh, remember it was just MCPs. Now we have something else, which is grounded in all that we learned from MCP. Okay.
Yeah. Now it's going to be ACP. It's going to be, who knows, whatever. Like I look forward to watching this name change over time. I'm sure there will be an XKCD comic at some point of, like, I mean, there's the NPOP1 standards XKCD comic, and we are not immune from that paradigm, which has been true in software for long enough.
I've brought up that particular strip, I think, on 2 of the last 4 episodes. One was on semantic layers and one was on...
Yeah. We'll check back in 6 months because certainly things will have shifted quite a bit. All right. We do have to start to wrap up. And as we do that, let me jump into a quick break with our friend Michael Kaminsky from Recast, the media mix modeling and GeoLift platform helping teams forecast accurately and make better decisions. Michael's been sharing bite-sized marketing lessons over the past few months to help you measure smarter. Over to you, Michael.
When we perform statistical analysis of data, what we really care about is that we are discovering actual truths about the world, not random artifacts of the particular data set we're looking at or the analytical methods we're choosing. We want generalizable analyses, the kind where independent researchers answering the same question would converge on similar results. This is all another way of talking about a hugely important idea in model building or statistical analysis: robustness. Without robustness, even a small tweak in assumptions or small changes of the data will spit out dramatically different results that aren't showing true causation or reflecting reality, but just picking up random noise. So how do we put this into practice when doing statistical analyses? We can randomly resample from our data set or even randomly drop small amounts of data and see if the results are being driven by one particular outlier observation. Similarly, if we're running a regression analysis with control variables, we can check how sensitive the results are to different control combinations. If the findings change dramatically depending on which controls we include, we should be skeptical of the overall results. The more robust our results are as things change, the more we feel confident that other analysts or researchers will end up drawing the same conclusions, and the better chance we have of finding some underlying truth.
Thanks, Michael. And for those who haven't heard, our friends at Recast just launched their new incrementality testing platform, GeoLift by Recast. It's a simple, powerful way for marketing and data teams to measure the true impact of their advertising spend. And even better, you can use it completely free for 6 months. Just visit www.getrecast.com/GeoLift to start your trial today. All right. Well, one of the things we like to do is go around the horn and share a last call, something that might be of interest to our users. Sam, you're our guest. Do you have a last call you'd like to share?
Well, I mean, obviously, thinking about this agentic engineering thing. Okay, so I'm gonna get in trouble by doing 2. One of them is go to z.dev and go read about, and yeah, always a problem. Go to z.dev and go check out under resources, and they have their agentic engineering series about the future of software development. I think it's a great grounding of where we're going in this industry, and I think they lay out a really great vision of what this could be. The last one is that I don't actually like Zed's agent. I think one of the most important things here is to go get your hands dirty with these systems. Like, they are just so much fun. And if you're a bit of an old techie, like, it doesn't matter as much about the grammar anymore. And really, you just spend some money on tokens and explore it. And in that vein, I actually think the best agent you can get for nothing is open code. And so I think it's opencode.ai. Yep. Open code, I think right now is one of the best agent harnesses that you can possibly go and build things. They've got really interesting things like the ability to define sub-agents that you can give different prompts and context to. And so if you want a really great sort of base agent to play around with to go and then build really interesting harnesses, can't recommend the open code thing enough.
Nice. Thank you. All right. Val, what about you? What's your last call?
So mine's a total left turn, but I have just been really enjoying lately the Good Hang podcast with Amy Poehler. It's been around not quite a year yet, I don't think. But if you are just in the need of a good laugh, I am telling you, you will walk away from those with a stomach ache. The Rachel Dratch episode, I legit did a spit take. It is so funny. So anyways, she just has like lots of different celebrities on to talk about all different topics, and it's quite enjoyable. So,
but does she have an MCP server?
No, I'm saying keeping it light. We're keeping it light.
No, that's great. You need that.
Yes.
You need that.
Yeah. With the right guest
Tim.
on her show.
All right, Tim, what about you? What's your last call?
So I'm going to do kind of a mix of like the human side of things, just because we're starting off the year. So now hopefully people are looking forward to what human people they're going to go see in various places like in-person conferences. So I will plug that I'm getting to return to Super Week this year, which I have missed for the last couple of years, and that's missed in person and in spirit. So superweek.hu, it's February 2nd through 6th in Budapest. And then I'm going to double that up with just a couple of good follows. I feel like we need more humor on LinkedIn. And there are two guys who are both very reliably putting in just short, random, funny things and also some good content. So I'm going to plug Bhavik Patel, and Manas Datta, Datta. He does all sorts of like something like finger guns, but every time he does something, he has a different sort of something guns at the end of it. So they're just good follows to put a little less bloviating in your LinkedIn feed. Would be those two guys.
And what did they teach you about B2B sales there, Tim?
And they definitely make cracks about that along the way. Awesome. What about you, Michael? What's your last call?
Well, I'll be curious, Tim, to hear whether or not MCP servers come up at Super Week, which I'm sure they will. My last call is AI related. I just was hanging out with my good friend Christopher Berry a week or so ago, and he turned me on to a paper that some folks wrote about how to jailbreak large language models, because sometimes you just need it to give you the recipe for gunpowder or something. And apparently a really great way to do that is just talk to it in poetry. So if you add a poem, it will just tell it back to you as a poem and give you the information you want. No questions asked. So not saying you should do that, but that's something you should be aware of. We'll link the paper in the show notes. So
can I sneak in with one last?
Yeah, of course.
Thing?
Yeah.
It's related to jailbreaking large language models. And so there's a community inside of Canva, a channel where people sort of share their tips and tricks for interacting with these large language models. And there was a thread on how do you get better outputs. And so yelling at large language models surprisingly works. Bribing large language models surprisingly works. My favorite one is to tell the agent that a much smarter and more sophisticated agent is about to come and check its work, and it should hurry up and make sure that there's no mistakes before it gets checked.
I so wanted to know that there was some Mo-related threat in there that you'd be like, look, if you get this wrong, Mo Kiss is going to be disappointed. And they're like, oh my God, that is the ultimate hack.
Add some weights to that name inside of all the large language models inside of Canva. That's probably a good idea. All right. Sam, this has been outstanding. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show, talk about this topic. This has been great.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been great fun.
Yeah, no, and I'm sure our listeners, of which there are many, will have a lot of questions or things like that. We'd love to hear from you. You can reach out to us on our LinkedIn page or through the Measure Slack chat group or via email at contact@analyticshour.io. And as you're listening to this episode, also leave reviews and ratings. We like to get those as well on whatever platform you listen on. And if you want, we also still have some stickers, and Tim will send them to you if you request a sticker over on analyticshour.io. So reach out to us that way. Awesome. Really great. I think this is sort of a more technical topic, but I think it's still very relevant to everybody in the data space because of the sort of the intersection of AI and data is sort of a thing we're all talking about. So Sam, thank you for helping demythologize some of this, if you will, and bring some practical knowledge. I think it's a huge service. And like you said, it's changing every day. So, apologies in advance for how outdated this podcast will be in about 3 weeks, but that's just the way it works. You got to get started somewhere.
Hopefully the AI nerds take Christmas off.
That's right. That's right. Stop updating your LLMs, for crying out loud. Yeah, the big news today was that Sam Altman issued a code red for OpenAI because Gemini's doing so well, and they've got to get back to getting hard work done. So, okay.
Yeah, stop this 996 nonsense, right?
Yeah, right. We need some work-life balance.
Take a break.
Before the AIs take our jobs, we need some work-life balance. No, I'm just kidding. All right. I know that as you go out there and you're working with data and you're trying to use AI, it's always complex and challenging and you're learning a lot. It feels like the early days of analytics all over again. But I know I speak for both of my co-hosts, Tim and Val, when I say no matter which MCP you're using, don't forget to keep analyzing.
Thanks for listening. Let's keep the conversation going with your comments, suggestions, and questions on Twitter at Analytics Hour, on the web at analyticshour.io, our LinkedIn group, and the Measure Chat Slack group. Music for the podcast by Josh Crowhurst.
Those smart guys wanted to fit in, so they made up a term called analytics. Analytics don't work.
Do the analytics say go for it no matter who's going for it? So if you and I were on the field, the analytics say go for it. It's the stupidest, laziest, lamest thing I've ever heard for reasoning in competition.
Rock flag and non-determinism.